It's been an incredible story, one of a man who's single-handedly been tending to a park memorial for a US bomber plane crash for decades, ever since that troubled plane, returning from a World War II operation, crash-landed, avoiding him and his friends playing in the park when he was just 8 years old. By now, many people around the world know the story of Tony Foulds and the Mi Amigo disaster in Sheffield's Endcliffe Park in 1944. But that story, or at least Tony's recollection of it, has been brought into question. Former Sheffield star writer Martin Dawes has written a piece on his own website entitled "Tony and the Mi Amigo, Does It Add Up?". The main points of contention appear to be how long Tony Foulds has actually been attending to the memorial and whether Tony's story about the circumstances of the crash are true. BBC reports from when Dan Walker first met the pensioner in January suggest that Tony had looked after the memorial for a significant amount of time. Many seem to think in terms of decades, and watching back footage does suggest that. Both Dan Walker's first tweet about meeting Foulds and subsequently one of the first BBC reports states that Tony has been tending to the area, quote, ever since the crash happened.
Now, on the 22nd of February 1944, a US bomber crashed in a park in Sheffield with the loss of all 10 crew. One man who witnessed the tragedy has been tending to their memorial ever since.
However, recently revealed footage from a YouTube video interview by Harry Gold shows Tony Foulds himself suggesting that he had started visiting the memorial just 2 years ago. The interview was filmed in November 2018 and uploaded to YouTube in December 2018, well before Dan Walker's chance encounter with Tony brought the whole story to the public's consciousness in January 2019.
My routine has always been get up about 7, go down at market, have a breakfast, stay with my mates till about 3. 2 years ago, for some unknown reason, same thing, bus, market, but instead of meeting my friends, I ended back coming back up here.
Now, even if Tony has been looking after the memorial for just 2 years, then that isn't insignificant. How many other people do you know that have quietly dedicated themselves to something seemingly so selfless for so long? Even at 2 years, Tony should absolutely be commended for all the work he's done. But on the face of it, things do seem a little murky. Martin Dawes claims to have spoken with an unnamed source at the Friends of Porter Valley, a group who occasionally tidy around Endcliffe Park and indeed the memorial itself. That source says that nobody from the group had ever seen or met Tony until Dan Walker and BBC Breakfast brought him to everyone's attention, going so far as to say that they had undertaken some volunteer workday activities in and around the memorial over the years, but presumably not at the time or times Tony has been there. Dawes also claims to have spoken to Tony himself at the memorial recently, and a pensioner insists he had been attending to the site since 1953, something Dawes suggests is odd since the memorial wasn't erected until 1969. Martin Dawes also asked Tony about the circumstances of the crash, something Tony has been consistent about in every video and interview I've seen from him, in saying that the pilot tried to get he and his friends to clear the grass, but they mistakenly thought he was just waving at them, and they just waved back, forcing the pilot to avoid them and instead crash into the trees behind the field. In fact, every video I've watched regarding this story, only one inconsistency occurs in Tony's accounts of the day. The BBC seem to sanitise things a little, saying that Tony and his friends were simply playing on the field, even suggesting they were playing football, but away from broadcast cameras, Foulds tells a story that he was there because he had arranged to have a scrap with some kids from a rival school in the park.
So we decided this particular day, 3 from each would go and have a scrap in the field.
Historian David Harvey, the author of Mi Amigo, the story of Sheffield's flying fortress, disagrees with Tony's story though. In the book he says that claims the planes crashed avoiding children on the field is an urban legend that seemed to start in the 90s. In his research, Harvey spoke to many first-hand witnesses and read numerous newspaper reports, and none ever suggested it was the case that the pilot was avoiding children. As well as eyewitness accounts, it is claimed photographic evidence would also dispute this version of events. Harvey suggests that had the plane avoided children on the grass, the nose of the crashed plane would have been facing uphill, whereas all the evidence shows it pointing in the opposite direction, downhill. All first-hand witness accounts in fact suggest the aircraft simply spiralled out of the sky and dropped on the crash site, rather than anything resembling a controlled descent on what they call a belly landing. So what is the story here? Has Tony Foulds lied? Well, I suspect it's much more complicated than that. I've watched all the BBC footage and more interviews with Tony from elsewhere. The interesting thing is that he never himself states how long he has been tending to the memorial for. The presenters all seem to do that for him, and he just kind of agrees. I'm not sure it would ever be proven either way. Maybe someone said he had been tending to the memorial for nearly as long as suggested, probably by mistake, and he might have felt forced to go along with it from that point. Remember, this is an old man being swept up in a very quick and enveloping media circus, and something like that can just daze and confuse you. At some point, it might have just been easier to go along with what everyone was saying. As I said earlier, if he has been looking after that memorial for just 2 years, then that's an achievement in itself. Other than a bit of fleeting celebrity and suggestions of a star on the Walk of Fame outside the town hall, Tony hasn't really gotten anything out of the story personally, to my knowledge, so he wouldn't have benefited from purposefully deceiving anyone. It does seem sad that it took mainstream media coverage to get attention on the memorial and force the council to make the proper repairs to the area around it. I also feel for the Friends of Porter Valley group, who've looked after the memorial many times over the years without any real recognition at all for doing so, where Tony now seemingly gets all the plaudits. And of course David Harvey has long researched the circumstances of the crash and published books about it. However, what Tony did help to make happen was incredible. Thousands of people attended the flypast with millions more watching on TV. That's truly remarkable. He brought the city together in remembrance of 10 men who died 75 years ago. He brought worldwide attention on the city and the story of the crash, and possibly helped to unearth many similar stories of servicemen who lost their lives in similar circumstances during the wars. Does this story about being on the field as a child during the crash add up? Well, I'll let you and the historical records decide that for yourself based on the evidence. One thing that is disappointing though is the angle that journalists and news media took on the whole thing.
Again, this is important to state, this is not about Tony. You've never made this about you.
No,
this is about remembering these men and what they did for Tony and many others who were playing in the park that day.
Despite repeatedly offering platitudes that it isn't about Tony, they continually made the whole thing revolve around him, to the point that people are now questioning the integrity of an old age pensioner. Yes, Tony Foulds was a catalyst and a current human element to the story, but going as far as to create hashtags such as #GetTonyHisFlyPast and #TonyGotHisFlyPast, it increasingly made things about him rather than what something like #GetMiAmigoAFlyPast or #MiAmigoFlyPast would have done. What do you think of this whole scenario? Does it matter? Is Martin Dawes right? Is it right to be questioning Tony Foulds? Should we ensure that we're accurately cataloguing historical events like this? Let us know what you think in the comments below. If you're interested in reading David Harvey's book on the history of the Mi Amigo crash, there's a link in the description, as well as links to Martin Dawes' blog post and a link to Harry Gould's interview video. Thanks for watching, watch more Sheffield videos at my channel, and please subscribe for even more Sheffield Guide videos coming soon.